At exactly 2:17 a.m., satellites orbiting over western Russia caught a strange flicker on thermal scans. Three faint heat blooms along separate oil corridors, feeding Moscow's industrial heart. Within moments, those tiny pulses grew into infernos stretching miles wide. No warning, no alarms, no air defense intercepts. Three of Russia's most critical oil pipelines had erupted almost at the same time, and intelligence officers would later discover the most chilling part. Ukraine had waited for this moment, waited until every pipeline was filled to maximum capacity, then pulled the trigger. For months before the explosions, nothing seemed unusual. The Russian Ministry of Energy had proudly declared that domestic output was back to optimum flow levels. Engineers at the Oral, Tver and Ryazan distribution nodes worked overtime to stabilise pressure across the northwestern corridor, a massive web of oil pipelines known internally as the Triad Line. Every day, thousands of tons of crude surged through those veins toward refineries outside Moscow, Kaluga and Smolensk. The system was old but efficient, designed during the Soviet era to withstand bombardment and cyber interference. To most, it looked invincible. But somewhere deep inside Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, the DRU analysts were watching those same pressure reports in real time. Through intercepted maintenance signals, they learnt that by late October, all three Triad pipelines would be operating at 98 to 100% capacity. That meant maximum flow, maximum pressure, and maximum vulnerability. The Ukrainian plan was simple in design but complex in timing. Strike not when the pipelines were idle or half full, but when they were bursting with product. When a single spark could cascade into a national catastrophe. Weeks before the operation, field agents deployed across Sumy, Chernihiv and Kharkiv oblasts. Hidden in farmlands and old barns, they assembled custom loitering munitions, small radar-resistant drones built from civilian components. Each cost less than $1,000. They looked fragile but carried payloads strong enough to pierce pipeline steel. The drones were guided by terrain-following sensors and linked through a short-burst encrypted mesh, relaying position data through a network of disguised relay stations. At precisely 11:46 p.m, the night before the attack, Ukrainian signals units intercepted a Russian transmission confirming full compression levels on the Oral-Ryazan route. That was the green light. Commanders in Poltava sent a short-coded order, condition zenith. Within minutes, launch teams activated 12 UAVs from 3 different sites. Each carried a shaped charge fitted with thermobaric ignition, designed not only to rupture the pipeline, but to ignite every ounce of vaporized crude around it. At 2:12 a.m, the first cluster crossed into Russian airspace at treetop height, moving just 40 feet above ground. Radar couldn't see them. Anti-air systems were asleep. The drones used the cover of autumn fog and the noise of distant freight trains. They split into 3 cells, each heading for one of the Triad's arteries. To the north, the Oral line. To the east, the Ryazan branch. To the south, the Tver corridor. The attack was synchronized to the second. Ukrainian operators monitored progress via silent telemetry, no video feed, no transmissions, just coded signals. Pulse, blink, steady. At 2:17 a.m, 3 lights blinked in unison on a screen in Poltava. That was confirmation. Seconds later, seismic monitors across western Russia detected faint tremors followed by a blinding surge of heat visible from space. The Oral line erupted first, then 3.7 seconds later, Ryazan. The Tver line followed almost instantly. In less than 10 seconds, 3 of Russia's largest crude arteries were on fire. Inside Moscow, pressure alarms screamed across the national pipeline grid. Control operators at Transneft headquarters believed it was a software glitch. They tried to close emergency valves, but the command lines were jammed locked by a flood of false data injected into the SCADA system minutes earlier. Ukraine hadn't just destroyed the pipelines, it had blinded the entire control network. While flames engulfed pumping stations, Russian emergency units scrambled. Local fire brigades reached the sites too late. Each inferno stretched hundreds of metres high. The triad network had been severed, its core pressure dropped to zero, over 2 million barrels of oil burned in the first 30 minutes alone. But this wasn't a random strike. It was an operation months in the making, designed for one specific moment, the night Russia's oil lifelines were most full, most vulnerable, and least protected. The question was no longer how Ukraine did it, but how long they had been waiting to make their move. At first light, the map of the strike looked almost surgical. 3 blackened scars where a living network of oil had once pulsed. Each wound miles long and still smoking, each sending a plume that climbed so high satellites could read it as a new weather front. The immediate aftermath was chaos stitched into spreadsheets, pressure graphs with abrupt zeros, alarm logs with identical abort codes, and plant cameras that recorded nothing but a white glare as flames swallowed steel. In Moscow, control rooms went from routine to emergency in a heartbeat. Engineers who had spent careers trusting redundant systems found themselves facing impossible questions. If this had been a simple act of sabotage, it would have left a trail. But the evidence told a different story. The pipelines had been struck when they were at full flow, when their very design made them most dangerous. That choice transformed a technical hit into a strategic collapse. Fuel that would have been shipped calmly through pumps and valves instead vaporized in mid-transit, turning corridors into firestorms and sending burning slicks into riverways and fields. Regional airports reported immediate fuel shortages. Military units closest to the capital watched convoys reroute and fuel convoys slow to a crawl under new escort procedures. The front lines felt the shock within hours. Artillery units that planned to rotate, mechanised brigades expecting refuels, logistics hubs that had calculated supply lines for weeks all had to stop and rethink. Commanders who relied on pipelines for predictable delivery now faced a patchwork of tanker trucks, diverted rail loads, and a fragile system of temporary storage that could not replace the steady pulse the triad had provided. Politically, the strike was a scalpel and a message. Telegram channels and state media lit up with competing narratives. Some claimed insider complicity, others blamed foreign terror, and a corner of analysts whispered about a long-prepared intelligence operation. The Kremlin ordered closed-door briefings while the Ministry of Energy blamed a coordinated technical failure. International monitors issued warnings about the environmental toll. Rivers choked with oil, agricultural land scorched, and air quality plummeting in towns hundreds of miles downwind. Insurance markets reacted almost immediately. Energy traders repriced risk across the region as if a new reality had arrived overnight. But beneath the headlines, a quieter war of information unfolded. Bits of intercepted chatter and leaked reports suggested the attack had not been improvisation, but the endpoint of a patient campaign. Analysts mapped out months of preparation, reconnaissance feeds collected by covert teams, equipment hidden in civilian areas, and a steady pattern of probing that never rose to the level of a crisis until the moment chosen. That timing was the political genius of the strike. By waiting, the attackers had forced the defender into the worst possible state, full capacity on essential arteries, and then delivered the blow that turned engineering vulnerability into strategic paralysis. On the ground, first responders battled not just heat, but logistics. Fire brigades in many towns lacked the foam and tanker access required to fight fuel-fed infernos. Some units reportedly stood by until pressure stabilised, a terrible calculus repeated in other major industrial accidents where attempting to approach a live rupture invites further catastrophe. Civilian volunteers formed human chains to move livestock away from burning fields. Hospital emergency rooms filled with workers suffering smoke inhalation. Meanwhile, military planners on both sides recalculated. For the side that had lost supply, the immediate priority was restoring fuel to critical nodes and defending the new, more vulnerable lines of transport. Tanker convoys now became moving targets, and roads once considered secondary arteries gained strategic value overnight. For those who had executed the operation, the payoff was clear. Not only had they inflicted material damage, they had also forced their opponent into a reactive posture, stretching scarce resources thin and turning the geography of supply into a battlefield. Questions remained. Who enabled the operation at the tactical level? How many assets were lost in the strike? And what would come next? But one fact crystallised quickly. After the fires died down and the smoke cleared, The landscape of logistics and psychology had changed. A system once taken for granted could no longer be assumed secure, and the ripple effects of that realisation would be felt in military plans, energy markets, and the daily lives of millions for months to come. By dawn the next day, the flames had dimmed, but the shock had only deepened. Satellite images released by independent observers revealed the full scope of the disaster. 3 parallel infernos tracing across Russia's western corridor like veins of molten light. The scale stunned even veteran analysts. Each pipeline represented not just metal and fuel, but an entire ecosystem of logistics. Storage depots, pump stations, compressor hubs, and the digital nervous system that synchronized them. Now, all of it lay crippled. The official Russian statement described the event as a coordinated act of external interference. But within internal briefings, the tone was panic. No one could explain how a foreign strike had reached so deep, so precisely, with such perfect timing. Rumours inside the Energy Ministry spoke of a ghost network, malware hidden in pipeline control systems months before the explosions, waiting only for a remote trigger. Others blamed the impossible, that someone inside had deliberately left the valves open and disabled isolation protocols. But as investigators argued, Ukraine stayed silent. No acknowledgement, no denial, no leaks. Only a cryptic line from a senior defence official. Pressure defines weakness. It was all the confirmation anyone needed. The impact rippled far beyond the borders of Russia. European markets jolted overnight. Crude prices spiked nearly 8% in a single session. Refineries across Belarus and Western Russia went into emergency slowdown to preserve what remained of supply. Meanwhile, on encrypted military channels, Russian logistics commanders scrambled to reroute convoys, shifting to road and rail transport at a massive scale. Convoys of tanker trucks began moving under heavy escort toward forward bases, but this too was part of the trap. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, already scanning major highways, now had endless soft targets to choose from. Within 48 hours, the first convoys were hit by FPV drones near Bryansk and Kursk, each explosion amplifying the sense that nowhere was safe. The destruction of the pipelines was not only physical, it shattered predictability, forcing Moscow to move like a wounded animal, defensive and paranoid. Every road became a risk, every convoy a potential beacon for attack. The psychological tremor within Russia's command was immediate and visible. Generals demanded answers from the Air Defense Bureau, furious that no early warning system had caught the inbound UAVs. The radar operators swore the skies were clean. No signatures, no alarms, nothing but normal weather clutter. Engineers at Transneft insisted the data loss was due to sabotage from inside the network. The FSB opened multiple investigations, arresting mid-level technicians suspected of negligence. But behind closed doors, even the Kremlin recognised the truth: the enemy had evolved. This was no longer a war of trenches and artillery. It was a war of patience, of data, of precise timing, and where a few kilograms of explosives could do what entire battalions could not. The attack was a message written in fire, not to civilians, but to the Russian war machine itself. Your walls are hollow. Your security is an illusion. Days later, as the fires cooled and repair crews began clearing the twisted steel, Ukraine's intelligence service released a single image. A satellite snapshot taken moments after detonation, showing 3 glowing craters aligned like a constellation. The caption read simply, "Synchronization achieved." It wasn't an official claim, but it didn't need to be. The world had already drawn its conclusions. Analysts in Washington, London and Berlin described the strike as one of the most sophisticated covert operations of the war, a perfect blend of cyber infiltration, timing and kinetic precision. But inside Kyiv, no celebration followed. For the planners, this was not revenge or spectacle, it was arithmetic. A calculated disruption meant to bleed the Russian war machine of its most vital resource. Fuel. Without fuel, tanks don't move, aircraft don't launch, and supply convoys grind to a halt. The strike was not designed to destroy forever, only to remind every recovery would now take longer, cost more, and carry the shadow of uncertainty. By the end of that week, Moscow's skyline was a haze of olive grey. Civilian flights were delayed. City buses rationed diesel. Gas stations ran dry in satellite towns. For the first time in years, Muscovites queued for fuel as military trucks rolled past them toward the front. The illusion of distance, that the war was far away,